What if I told you that in 1984, RadioShack had email, online shopping, even chat rooms before the average American had ever heard the word internet? That they had everything except the ability to sell it. This is the untold story of how one of America's biggest tech retailers accidentally invented the future and then let it slip through their fingers. A forgotten digital empire that came years before AOL, Amazon, or Google, and the slow-motion collapse that followed. In the early 1980s, going online wasn't a thing. There was no public internet, no Wi-Fi, no web browsers, just a scattered landscape of hobbyist networks and experimental systems. If you had a modem at home, you were probably an engineer, a hacker, or someone with too much time on their hands. Computers were still largely seen as business machines or expensive toys for tinkerers. Most Americans had never touched one. Cable TV was still growing, fax machines were high-tech, and long-distance phone calls were a hassle. In that world, the idea of checking email from your couch or shopping on a screen sounded like science fiction. But in the background, some unlikely players were already trying to build that future, starting with a retail chain that most people thought just sold batteries. By the early 80s, RadioShack was everywhere. Over 7,000 stores across the U.S., often just a short drive away, sometimes two in the same town. Owned by Tandy Corporation, it had become America's tech store before tech was even a category. If you needed a fuse, a speaker wire, or a weird battery no one else carried, you went to RadioShack. But it wasn't just parts and gadgets. Tandy had quietly positioned itself at the crossroads of retail and computing. They weren't just selling tech, they were helping invent it, and they had something most of their competitors didn't: physical reach, trust from consumers, and a front row seat to the future. That mix gave them an edge when a new idea began to form. What if you could connect your computer to something bigger? The TRS-80 wasn't just a quirky machine with a clunky keyboard. Released in 1977, it was one of the first mass-market home computers. It sold surprisingly well, over 200,000 units in its first few years, at a time when Apple and Commodore were still trying to find their audiences. Tandy had already won shelf space in suburban living rooms. The TRS-80 made computing personal. You could write code, play games, store recipes, or, if you had the gear, even connect to a telephone line. That last part is key because Tandy didn't just see the computer as a device. They saw it as a terminal, a two-way window into something much bigger. And in 1984, they tried to build that window. Tandy partnered with a company called The Source, one of the earliest online service providers. Their goal was to bring Videotex into the mainstream, a platform where users could access digital information through their TVs or computers using a phone line. Think of it as a private internet years before the public one. It wasn't just Tandy either. Sears and IBM teamed up to create a competing service called Prodigy. These weren't niche experiments. They were serious business bets. Everyone involved saw the same thing coming. People would eventually live part of their lives online. Tandy, with its nationwide footprint and computer-ready customers, thought it could lead the charge, and for a brief moment, it did. What Videotex offered in the early 80s still sounds impressive today. Users could send and receive email, read up-to-date news and weather, join bulletin boards, basically early forums, and chat in real time. They could check bank balances, transfer money, even shop from home. All of this over a standard phone line, years before AOL or Amazon existed. It was a real functioning digital world, just hidden inside a black and white interface and locked behind clunky hardware. The pieces were there, the technology worked, it was the internet before the internet, but it had one fatal flaw. Almost no one knew what to do with it. And worse, no one could explain why they needed it. That disconnect would define what happened next. To use Videotex in the 1980s, you didn't need a new internet connection, just a phone line. You'd either hook up your TRS-80 computer with a modem or use a special set-top box that connected directly to your television. Once online, the screen would load blocky menus in black and white or sometimes low-res color. It was slow, painfully slow by today's standards, but it worked. You could select a store, browse listings, and even make purchases with a credit card. Email, news, chat, everything loaded in text-based pages. It was clunky, but revolutionary. This was digital interactivity in a time when most people didn't even have cordless phones. It felt like science fiction coming to life, if you had the patience to wait for each page. Tandy knew they had something futuristic, and they leaned into it. They branded the experience as the electronic shopping mall. TV commercials showed families skipping crowded stores, shopping in their pajamas from home. It wasn't just convenience, it was a lifestyle upgrade. Ads promised weather reports at your fingertips, movie tickets from your sofa, even electronic banking. This wasn't just a gadget, it was the future of daily life, brought to you by RadioShack. But here's where things got tricky. The message was ambitious, but the execution wasn't always clear. The system was complicated to set up. The interfaces weren't intuitive. And most importantly, no one could quite explain why the average person needed this yet. And that confusion showed. For all the buzz and promise, most people just didn't get it. The idea of shopping through a TV, reading news through a computer, it sounded neat, but it didn't feel necessary because the hardware wasn't cheap either. Between the modem, the subscription fee, and the equipment itself, you could easily spend hundreds of dollars to join a network where there wasn't much happening yet. Early adopters were few and far between. Many buyers returned their kits. Others never even plugged them in. For a public still getting used to microwaves and VCRs, this was a leap too far. Instead of igniting a digital revolution, Videotex landed with a thud. It looked like the future, but felt like a solution in search of a problem. The core issue wasn't the tech. It was timing. Videotex was just too early. The infrastructure wasn't ready. Most homes didn't have modems, and connecting over a phone line often meant blocking your only household phone. There was no cultural context for email, digital news, or online forums. Even the term online didn't mean anything to the average American. This wasn't a bad idea. It was a premature one. Tandy and its partners had built something that would make perfect sense 10 years later. But in the early 80s, the market didn't know what to do with it, and the companies behind it didn't know how to teach them. It wasn't that people didn't want the future, they just didn't recognize it when it showed up in their living room. By 1985, the writing was on the wall, adoption was crawling, customer support lines were flooded with confusion, returns outnumbered sign-ups in some regions, and Tandy, once so bullish on the future, started quietly pulling resources. The marketing dried up, the set-top boxes stopped shipping. Behind the scenes, executives were growing restless. They had bet on a future that people weren't ready to buy. It didn't matter that the technology worked or that it would later become the foundation of billion-dollar companies. What mattered was that no one was using it now. Videotex wasn't just an innovation, it was a warning shot. Even the best ideas die if they show up before their time. And Tandy was about to pivot hard, leaving their digital dream behind. In hindsight, RadioShack had something priceless: time. Their online service was live in 1984. That's a full 7 years before AOL went mainstream in 1991. 7 years in tech is an eternity. While most people still thought email was something only the military used, Tandy was already shipping systems that let people send messages from their living room. They didn't just have the idea. They had hardware, software, and distribution all under one roof. No one else had that. Apple didn't. IBM didn't, not even Microsoft. If Tandy had nurtured the platform, iterated on the product, trained their staff, and marketed it clearly, they could have owned the online experience before anyone else entered the race, but instead that lead slipped through their fingers. One of the biggest issues was that no one inside Tandy seemed to agree on what they were actually building. Was Videotex a new kind of store, a communications tool, a media hub, a banking terminal? Different departments saw it differently, and that confusion trickled down. Engineers focused on functionality. Marketers leaned on shopping. Retail leadership just wanted to sell more hardware. There wasn't a unified vision, no clear story being told. The end result felt scattered. A promising technology wrapped in a mixed message. Without internal alignment, the company struggled to focus on what mattered most, getting people to understand why this weird new thing was useful in the first place. When it came time to explain Videotex to the public, things went sideways fast. Early ads were vague, filled with jargon like asynchronous communication and digital terminal access. Some tried to frame it as entertainment, others as banking. Most leaned on the electronic shopping mall idea, but didn't actually show how it worked. The average American had no clue what any of it meant, and the people who might have cared, early tech adopters, were left with no technical documentation, no roadmap, no community. It was a product in search of a language. The pitch was either too futuristic or too bland, and it failed to spark curiosity or trust. In the end, it didn't matter how revolutionary it was. If you can't explain it, you can't sell it. Oh. The in-store experience was supposed to be the secret weapon. With thousands of locations and millions of foot traffic visits, RadioShack had the perfect platform to show off the future. But the execution fell apart. Employees weren't trained to understand the system, much less teach it. Most didn't know how to set up the modem, much less troubleshoot it. Demos, when available, often didn't work. Either the lines were down or the equipment had been disconnected. Customers would ask, "What does it do?" and get blank stares. It became a vicious cycle. Staff didn't believe in it, so they didn't sell it, which meant fewer users, less momentum, and eventually indifference. The stores that once gave Tandy its power became one of its greatest weaknesses. Tandy wasn't the only one chasing the digital future. Around the same time, Sears and IBM launched Prodigy, another online network aimed at home users. It had better visuals, stronger backing, and a clearer focus on content and family use. Prodigy had newsletters, games, even comics. It looked more like what AOL would eventually become, but even with all that polish, adoption was slow. The same problems applied: too early, too expensive, too hard to explain. Still, the contrast was telling. While Prodigy had a unified vision and cleaner branding, Tandy's offering felt like an afterthought. Technically advanced, but lost in its own messaging. The difference wasn't in the tech. It was in how you packaged the story. At the heart of it all was a simple truth. Tandy was a company built for the analog world. Its leaders were experts in radios, batteries, and storefront logistics, not digital ecosystems. They knew how to sell physical gadgets, not invisible networks. So when it came time to pitch something intangible, like online access, they defaulted to what they knew. They tried to sell the future like it was just another VCR or home stereo. It wasn't malicious, it was generational. The people making decisions didn't live in a connected world, so they couldn't sell one. And in those crucial years when vision and clarity mattered most, the gap between potential and execution grew too wide to cross. By the early 1990s, AOL had cracked the code that RadioShack couldn't. They took all the confusing, futuristic promise of online networks and made it feel simple, almost fun. The interface was friendly. The setup was easy. They mailed installation discs to every household in America. And they had a genius hook. You've got mail. Suddenly, Going online didn't sound like a tech project. It sounded like checking your inbox. While RadioShack had focused on modems and menus, AOL sold connection, emotion, curiosity. It became the default portal for millions of new users. The timing was right, yes, but so was the storytelling. AOL succeeded not because they invented something new, but because they made it human. Around the same time, other players like CompuServe, Genie, and eventually Earthlink joined the race. Each brought their own flavor, from hobbyist bulletin boards to business tools. They weren't flashy, but they slowly built the culture of the early internet. Forums, file sharing, even chat rooms. RadioShack? Nowhere to be found. The company that had pioneered many of these ideas a decade earlier was retreating into its stores, doubling down on hardware and letting others define what digital life would look like. The irony was brutal. While the world was catching up to the ideas Tandy helped start, Tandy itself had moved on. They'd had the map, but they stopped exploring. Here's the kicker. The technology wasn't the problem. RadioShack had working modems. They had terminals that could display graphics and text. They had a functioning online network, email, news, shopping, even stock quotes. It wasn't a pipe dream. It was real, and it was live, years before anyone else got close. But it didn't matter, because in business, especially with something new, the delivery is everything. A good idea launched badly will always lose to a mediocre idea launched well. The bones of a connected future were sitting in living rooms. In 1985, most people just didn't know what they were looking at, and no one from RadioShack could explain it in a way that stuck. Over the years, former Tandy employees have shared a bittersweet truth. Many of them knew how groundbreaking the service was. Engineers saw the potential for an always-on information network. Some managers even pitched ways to push it harder. Better training, better demos, better software. But the company's culture wasn't built for digital bets. One executive reportedly said, "We're a retail company. We sell things you can touch." And with that mindset, innovation died quietly. Talented people left. Budgets dried up. The network withered. Some staff watched AOL rise and thought, that should have been us. And they were right, but no one at the top was willing to take the leap. So here's the haunting question. What if RadioShack had leaned in? What if they'd stuck with the online network, refined the experience, and educated the public instead of backing away? They had everything Amazon and AOL would eventually need: hardware, distribution, even recurring user accounts. They were already in homes. They had the digital bridge before people knew they wanted one. With the right leadership, they could have been the gateway to the internet for a generation. Imagine a world where RadioShack mail was as common as You've Got Mail, where shopping from your couch wasn't a novelty in 2020s, but a norm in 1990. It wasn't impossible. They just let it go. By the late 1980s, RadioShack's grand digital experiment simply faded out. No press release, no pivot strategy. The online network, once pitched as the electronic shopping mall of the future, was quietly unplugged. Tandy moved resources elsewhere. The terminals were pushed to the back of the store. The vision was never formally declared dead. It just stopped being mentioned. Like a dream no one wanted to admit had failed. And so one of the boldest attempts to bring the internet into American homes a full decade early ended not with drama, but with indifference. The company that had once stood on the edge of tomorrow just turned back, shrugged, and walked away. Then came the 90s. The actual internet, dial-up modems, browsers, .com startups, finally broke into the mainstream. This was the moment Tandy had once dreamed of, but they weren't part of it. AOL, Yahoo, Netscape, Amazon, they built the online culture. Meanwhile, RadioShack was selling phone cords and alkaline batteries. While others leaned into software, services, and subscription revenue, RadioShack stayed rooted in retail. The second wave of the internet came roaring in, sweeping up billions in value. Tandy could have ridden it, but instead they were standing on the shore, watching it pass them by. The moment they'd been too early for had finally arrived, and they weren't ready anymore. Not long after, the perception of RadioShack flipped completely. From a playground for tinkerers, hobbyists, and early adopters, it became a punchline. Kids who grew up playing with microchips and soldering irons now saw the store as irrelevant, outdated, even embarrassing. The brand that helped usher in personal computing had become synonymous with adapters, clearance racks, and staff who couldn't answer basic questions. Ironically, in an era that celebrated startups and tech disruption, RadioShack, a company that once disrupted retail itself, was now seen as a relic. It had stopped evolving, and the world noticed. The future had moved on without it. In the 2000s, RadioShack tried to reinvent itself, but without a clear identity. It launched cell phone kiosks, it sold toys, it tried hip rebranding campaigns, but none of it stuck. The stores felt cluttered and unfocused, lost between Best Buy and the Apple Store. Tech was moving faster than ever, but RadioShack was still playing catch-up with yesterday's gadgets. Leadership turnover didn't help. Marketing flopped, and as online shopping took off, the idea of walking into a strip mall for a USB cable started to feel absurd. The company that once wanted to bring digital life into the home couldn't even keep people coming through the front door. By 2015, the writing was on the wall. RadioShack filed for bankruptcy. Thousands of locations shuttered. A few franchises lingered on like faded echoes of a different era. But for all intents and purposes, it was over. The company that once stood on the brink of the internet age collapsed with barely a whisper from the tech world it helped inspire. No retrospectives, no applause, just silence. And maybe that's the saddest part, how a company can help start something massive, make one wrong turn, and be forgotten by the very future it helped create. RadioShack didn't lose because it lacked vision. It lost because it never figured out how to sell it. Today, when we casually order groceries from our phones or fire off emails while streaming a movie, it's easy to forget how strange that once sounded. But long before Amazon or Gmail, before online became a way of life, there was Videotex. And at the center of it, oddly enough, was RadioShack. Their 1984 service offered digital shopping, real-time messaging, and electronic mail, decades before those became normal. They didn't invent the internet, but they did prototype what the internet would feel like. In hindsight, it's clear. They helped sketch the blueprint. The functionality we now take for granted was already in motion. They just couldn't make it stick. Today, the TRS-80 and those early Videotex terminals sit behind glass in tech museums, gathering dust next to punch cards and dot matrix printers. Most people who walk by them don't know what they are. They look quaint, slow, a little goofy. But for a moment, they represented a window into the future. These weren't just clunky machines. They were test runs of a digital lifestyle that hadn't been invented yet. And like so many too early innovations, they've been reduced to historical trivia, the kind of thing tech historians smile at while casually noting they almost had it. It's a strange fate for something that once reached for tomorrow. The RadioShack story is a case study in what happens when good tech meets bad marketing. They had the vision, the hardware, the network, even the use cases. But what they didn't have, what they never figured out, was how to make people want it. They didn't tell a story. They didn't make it feel useful or exciting or personal. They launched a revolution, then explained it like a spec sheet, and that's the lasting lesson. In business, the idea isn't enough. The execution isn't even enough. You need to connect the dots for people. You need to tell them why it matters before someone else does it better. Today's tech giants don't forget that lesson. When Apple launches a product, they sell a lifestyle. When Amazon enters a market, they simplify the customer journey. Even startups know your pitch isn't about the tech, it's about the transformation. That's the irony. Everything RadioShack tried to do in the 80s is now commonplace, but the players who won were the ones who understood the how of adoption. They obsessed over user experience. They made complex things feel simple, and they never assumed that customers would just get it. They packaged the future in a way people could actually use, and that made all the difference. So here's the haunting thought. What other world-changing ideas have already come and gone simply because no one sold them right? What futures have we already missed? RadioShack didn't fail because it lacked vision. It failed because it didn't speak the right language. That quiet, forgotten product in 1984 could have changed everything if only someone had told a better story. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. Ideas don't shape the world on their own. People do. And the ones who know how to connect, persuade, and inspire, they're the ones who get to decide what the future looks like. They had it. They built it. They just didn't know what they had. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that the future doesn't always go to the first who gets there. It goes to the one who makes you believe it matters. And if you found this story as wild and strangely bittersweet as I did, take a second to like the video. It really helps. Subscribe if you want more stories about how strange decisions shape the tech we use every day. But more importantly, I want to hear from you. Do you think RadioShack could have been the next AOL or Amazon if they'd marketed it right? And what other companies do you think were too early and just vanished because of it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you like this one, you'll definitely want to check out my last video about how a taboo genre decided the winner of the VHS versus Betamax war. It's one of the most unexpected business moves in entertainment history.